Tensions between China and Japan just got a lot worse. China has already begun damaging Japan's struggling economy, warning its citizens not to visit Japan, and freezing imports of Japanese seafood and beef. But instead of backing down, Japan retaliated. Its defense minister announced missile deployments on Yonaguni Island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, to defend Taiwan from China. Chinese officials blasted the move as extremely dangerous, warning that more substantive retaliation is coming next, and that Japan's economy will feel it. But here's what the headlines miss. Japan also holds a hidden economic weapon, one that could hit China where it hurts the most. Within days of China issuing a travel warning on November 15th, more than 500,000 flight bookings from mainland China to Japan were cancelled. And it didn't stop there. Beijing then told airlines to cut flights all the way through March 2026, right across Chinese New Year, the peak travel season. For Japan, this is catastrophic. Chinese tourists are its biggest customer base. They make up roughly a quarter of all foreign visitors and about 27% of all tourism spending. In just the first 9 months of 2025, 7.49 million Chinese tourists entered Japan. So when China shuts that tap off, the impact hits immediately. Japan's markets reacted instantly. Shiseido, a makeup company that relies heavily on Chinese shoppers, plunged about 11%. Oriental Land, which runs Tokyo Disneyland, fell 5.8%. Major department stores dropped between 6 to 11%. This was a complete panic fest. And tourism isn't the only pressure point. China froze Japanese seafood imports, blocked Japanese beef, and halted Japanese film releases. These aren't just symbolic moves. Japan relies on Chinese demand across many of these sectors. Bloomberg estimates the tourism damage alone could cost Japan up to $14.2 billion, shaving 0.36% off their GDP. That might sound small, but it's actually a lot for an economy that's already in big trouble. In fact, Japan's economy actually shrank 1.8% in the last quarter. Inflation's currently at 3% and food prices are up 7.6%. Japan's debt, the highest debt to GDP ratio in the developed world, at a whopping 248.7%, now costs $192 billion a year just in interest payments. Japanese workers are feeling it too. Wages, after accounting for inflation, have already dropped for 9 straight months. The government knows the situation is bad. That's why on the 21st of November, Prime Minister Takaichi announced a $135 billion stimulus package trying to cushion the blow. And China isn't just Japan's biggest tourism source, it's Japan's largest trading partner overall. We're talking about $125 billion in Japanese exports to China annually. This problem is bigger for Japan than most people think. Yeah, they can try to attract tourists from other countries to replace Chinese visitors, but it can take years to build up the marketing, flight routes, and country-to-country relationships. Meanwhile, businesses are hurting now, and political pressure is building now, pushing Takaichi to back down. And that's exactly what Beijing wants. All their moves are calculated. China wants Japanese business leaders, voters, and opposition politicians to turn against Takaichi, to force her to retract her statement, to make an example out of Japan. Because from Beijing's perspective, what she said on November 7th was crossing the red line. By declaring that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be a survival-threatening situation for Japan, she effectively signaled that Japan might join a war against China. China cannot afford to let that go unpunished. If they do nothing, it sends a signal to every US ally in the region, like the Philippines, South Korea, or Australia, that standing up to China carries no cost. And so Beijing is hitting Japan where it hurts the most, the economy. But while China's pressure is landing hard, Japan is sitting on something far more dangerous. A weapon that could hurt China in ways it absolutely cannot afford. It's something China desperately needs and can't get anywhere else. Computer chips are the building blocks of AI, smartphones, and modern technology, and the valuable currency in China's current tech competition with the US. But these chips can't be made without a set of very specific materials. chips, and Japan quietly dominates a lot of them. The most important is called the photoresist, a special chemical that works like ink to print the tiny circuits on the chip. Without it, you can't make the chips. Just 4 Japanese companies control 70 to 90% of the world's supply, depending on the type. So almost every advanced chip China makes still relies on these Japanese chemicals. And here's the critical thing about photoresist. It has a short shelf life, around 6 months, which means you can't really hoard and stockpile it. Chinese chip production depends on constant regular shipments from Japan, but China's dependency doesn't stop there. Japan also controls more than half of the world's silicon wafers market. These are the blank discs the chips are built on. If photoresist is the ink, wafers are the paper. Japan also dominates ultra-pure hydrogen fluoride, the cleaning chemical used throughout chip making, and produces many of the precision tools chip factories rely on every day. These are not glamorous products, but they are the basic ingredients of the modern tech world, and China cannot replace them anytime soon. Now here's a key thing to understand about Japan's leverage. China's dependency for making chips has 2 layers: equipment and materials. The equipment is the giant chip-making machines used to build new factories. Think of this as ovens in a bakery. If you can't buy new ovens, you can still bake bread with the ones you have, but you can't really upgrade your kitchen or open new branches. The US, Japan, and the Netherlands have already restricted selling these machines to China. That's hurting China, but they're working hard to find ways around this restriction. But the materials like the photoresist, the wafers, and the ultra-pure chemicals are different. In the bakery, these are the flour, the sugar, and the butter. They get consumed every day. Once the factory runs out, production stops immediately. That's why Japan's leverage in this domain is so powerful. Restrict the materials and China's chip industry is severely threatened. And that's why Japan hasn't touched the materials yet. Unlike the chip-making equipment ban, this isn't a slow squeeze. It's an attempt to shut down China's chip production. It's so powerful a weapon that Japan can only use it once, and only in the most extreme scenario. China knows this, and despite all the money it has poured into chips, more than $150 billion over the last decade, it still can't escape the dependency. China is improving its chip designs. Its tech companies like Huawei have even found workarounds to train AI models without American tech. But chip manufacturing remains the bottleneck. China's domestic production of advanced photoresist is near zero. Even the older kinds from the 1990s are still mostly imported from Japan. China can design more chips, but Japan controls whether those chips can actually be manufactured. That's the choke point almost no one talks about, and it gives Tokyo enormous leverage. But here's the twist: the leverage cuts both ways. Because if Japan ever used this economic weapon, China has more ways to strike back that could devastate Japan's entire economy. China can escalate its economic pressure far more, and if it does, Japan pays an enormous price. Let's start with what's at stake. About 31,000 Japanese companies operate in China. Toyota factories, Uniqlo stores, electronics manufacturers, entire supply chains built over decades. Now, China's not going to literally take over these factories. They will put Chinese workers out of jobs and scare off every foreign investor. But here's what China can do. They can make life miserable for these Japanese companies. Customs delays can take weeks instead of days. There might be sudden safety violations or environmental fines that come out of nowhere, as well as endless tax audits. And if a company tries to leave China, good luck getting its money out of the country. And sometimes they make it personal. In 2023, China arrested a top executive from Astellas Pharma, a big Japanese drug company, and locked him up for 3.5 years on spying charges. That sent shockwaves through every Japanese company in China, because China showed them they can arrest their people anytime they wanted. Then there's what Japan depends on from China. The most important of all is that they still get 58% of its rare earth minerals from China. Rare earths are special materials you need to make pretty much any modern electronic device. Your smartphone, electric cars, wind turbines, military weapons, they all need rare earths. They're hard to mine and process, and China controls 85% of the world's supply. If China stops selling rare earths to Japan, it will cripple Japan's electronics industry, and China can put pressure on other Japanese products too. Remember that Japan exports $125 billion worth of goods to China every year, like cars, electronics, cosmetics, and more. We can't forget that Japan's economy is already struggling and can't survive an all-out economic war with its biggest trading partner, which means for Prime Minister Takaichi, using the nuclear option of cutting the chemicals China needs to make computer chips will be political suicide, because everyone's already putting pressure on her to back down. Starting with Japan's business world, the chairman of the Keidanren, Japan's most powerful business lobby, met with Takaichi and told reporters political stability is a prerequisite for economic exchange, and they urged the government to pursue constructive dialogue with China to resolve tensions. What he really meant was simple: stop provoking China or Japanese companies will pay the price. The heads of Japan's largest business groups were there too, all delivering the same warning to Takaichi. These are the same people behind companies like Toyota, Sony, and Uniqlo. They're now pressuring the government to cool things down with China before the damage gets worse. Then of course you have the political opposition coming after Takaichi. The leader of the main opposition party, the CDPJ, is hammering her in parliament, demanding she explain the damage her Taiwan comments have caused. Takaichi is getting squeezed from all sides. If she resorted to the cheap materials ban over Taiwan, the business world would turn on her completely, and the opposition in parliament would destroy her, not to mention the regular people who would suffer the most, as the economy tanks wouldn't stand for it. That's why she's keeping that option in reserve. It's not for responding to seafood or tourism bans, it's for extreme scenarios only, like if China actually invaded Taiwan. But here's where China has to be careful too. If they go too far with their economic pressure, they might push Takaichi into a corner where she has no choice. At that point, all the political pressure will flip around. She would have to hit back hard, even if it means using their hidden weapon. The whole situation is like a very intricate and high-stakes game of chess. One wrong move and you might lose, because neither leader can easily back down. If Takaichi took back what she said about Taiwan after all this pressure, she will look like she gave in to China's bullying. If Xi Jinping backed down publicly after coming on this strong, he will look weak at home. This standoff is a real test of power in Asia right now. Can China pressure a major US ally to back down on Taiwan? Or will Japan hold firm despite the pain, proving that China's economic leverage has limits? If China succeeds, it sends a message to every other US ally in the region: step out of line on Taiwan and your economy pays. And for Japan's hidden chip manufacturing leverage, that isn't just an economic tool. It's the question at the heart of China's future, whether it can ever become technologically independent or remain dependent on the very countries it sees as adversaries. Because this tech race, not the missiles, not the diplomatic headlines, is what will ultimately shape the balance of power in the world. But there's one place watching this crisis more closely than anywhere else: Taiwan. Because everything we just talked about directly shapes what happens to the island, which raises the question: we know about China's undying resolve to reunify with Taiwan, whether by force or otherwise. But what are China's actual plans to take Taiwan? Because it's not what most people think. I break down the most likely scenario and why it's already starting in this video right here.